We are finally on to the last High Renaissance lecture. I know it's been a while, but there's a lot to cover in the High Renaissance that you're expected to know because this is considered one of the most significant periods in Western art history. It's considered a golden age of Western art history. So what we're going to be covering today, or in this video, is the work of Michelangelo. Michelangelo was born outside of Florence. He was born into a family that felt that it had been sort of pushed out of the nobility and had great pride in this idea that they were nobles even though they weren't treated as nobles. He was very invested in Florence as a young man. He had been sort of scouted and not adopted as a son, but adopted into the Medici court where he got a lot of artistic training. And he also had access to things like Neoplatonic lectures, the art of other artists who were working in the court. Basically access to the humanist center of Florence. Another thing that he did in Florence was he became very interested in the teachings of Savonarola. And this is very counter to his interest in humanism. Savonarola was not a huge fan of humanism. He was also not a huge fan of the power structure of the oligarchs of Florence. One of the families in the oligarchy was the Medici. So Michelangelo's kind of a man with a torn soul. There's this constant interior struggle. And if you ever get a chance to read his poetry, there are many poems about his struggles. He is going to come to the attention of many of the powers that be in Rome. He'll get commissions from the Pope and others in Rome. And the two places that he mainly works are Florence and Rome, although he did a few things in Bologna and things like that. Let's start out by covering Michelangelo's Pietà. This work is fairly unique among his oeuvres. And by the way, oeuvre is a word that means all the work that an artist made. So it's the entire body of their artwork. And what is unique about it is the fact that this is the only work that Michelangelo ever signed. There are some great stories about Michelangelo lurking in the corner, seeing how his work was received when it was finally put up on its pedestal, and hearing that people thought it was by this other sculptor. That's very unlikely. The signature here appears to be very conscious for a few different reasons. First of all, what it says is Michelangelo Buonarroti of Florence made this. And this is a specific reference, is making this, not made this, but it's a specific reference back to signatures from the classical period, signatures of Greek artists. The other reason this seems to be a very conscious thing that he did when he first sculpted the work is he thought about where this was going. And this was a display work. Michelangelo had a commission from a French cardinal. We'll talk about that more in a bit. And that commission assumed a certain scope of work and paid a certain amount. This sculpture actually involved more work and more materials, and he really outdid himself on this one. This is probably because this was going to go in a mausoleum that was part of the St. Peter's complex. It's been moved now because where it used to be no longer exists, so it was moved into the main church. But that was a place where many people would go because the Vatican is the center of Christianity in Europe at this time. So he realized that a lot of people were going to see it. A lot of those people would be higher ups in the church. And he wants people to see what he's capable of doing. So he signs this, and in a way this is kind of like a billboard showing us what he can do. These are the services that you can get from Michelangelo Buonarroti. So that signature appears to be very conscious. Now, as I mentioned, this was commissioned by a French cardinal. And the subject matter of Pietà, which means Mary grieving the dead Christ, it's a reference to sorrow, is very unusual in Southern Europe before this. Michelangelo is going to do a lot of these, but then again, he might have been a secret Protestant who had some leanings towards Northern European things. We're not sure. What we can say was the French had done lots of Pietas before this. And I'm showing you a Gothic example of a Pieta, the Rotkin Pieta, from about 1300 to show you how this had been done in the past. When this subject was done in Northern Europe, typically there was a great stress in drawing the emotions out of the viewer. It's not necessarily mimetic, but there's no way you are going to miss A, that Christ is dead. He is very dead. He's in rigor mortis. He's flopping around on her lap. And the wounds of Christ are huge, and they were full of red paint initially. Mary is miserable. She looks like somewhere between distress and numbness. And her head is made disproportionate so that you have to focus on her emotions. If you look at Michelangelo's example, you are seeing something very different. Yes, the subject matter is the same. It is the dead Christ on Mary's lap. Although, it's going to take you a while to figure out what killed that guy, if you look at the body. He might need an autopsy to figure it out, whereas the Gothic example, that is clear. Mary looks a little sad, but she's not distraught. It's not obvious. And what Michelangelo is doing is he is maintaining this idea of the perfectibility of man during the Renaissance. He does not show Mary as an average woman mourning. He does not show Christ like the ickiness of a real dead body. He makes them look beautiful. The line of Christ's body is this beautiful flowing line that picks up the flowing lines in Mary's skirt. Mary is shown as this ideal beauty. This does not look like a 45-something-year-old woman who's been walking around in a climate with a lot of sun and very little sunscreen for the past 3 years. She is shown as the ideal, which is very common in the Catholic Church. But here, there's not even any kind of reference to instability of emotion. If you look for the wounds on Christ's body, they are very underplayed. They are very subdued. So I've drawn an arrow to the wound in his chest, and you really have to look to see that wound on his hand, and it does not look like he's had a nail driven through his hand for hours and hours and hours. And yes, I know that they didn't crucify people by putting their the nails in the hands, but this is the way it usually gets shown, so we're just going to deal with that. So he's showing them as ideal, and even though it's a Northern European subject matter, he shows it in a very Renaissance way, reflecting the humanism, the perfectibility of mankind, or in this case, of Mary. Another thing that Michelangelo has done is he has not made this floppy Christ who looks like he's about to fall off his mother's lap. And we might say, oh yeah, this Renaissance example seems so much more naturalistic than the Northern European example. But the reason Christ does not look as awkward is because the scale is off. Mary is huge in comparison to her adult son. He's 33 years old. And typically, if you ask a 33-year-old man to get on his mother's lap, well, he might need to be dead to do that. But also, you're not going to see this kind of proportion. It's going to be very awkward for the mother to hold them up. So what Michelangelo has done is he's played with the scale. The other thing is he's made a very nice kind of pyramidal structure. So there is a sense of stability and calm in this work. And it does not ask you to become very emotional. Instead, it allows you to remain like a very stable, intellectual being who understands what's going on, but processes it in an intellectual versus emotional way. And that's a very Renaissance attitude. We're now going to move on to a statue that's even more famous than Michelangelo's Pietà, and that is his David. We've all probably seen this, and it's so famous that it is now the subject of things like refrigerator magnets, light switch plates, and you gotta hand it to those Italians when they make souvenirs to go with their art. They do some really fun things. Yes, they have classy stuff, but they also have some stuff that's just kind of funny and maybe on the slightly on the crass side, like this light switch plate, or even these boxers that you can buy right outside the Florence Cathedral. By the way, they also have a barbecue apron like this. But all that aside, let's take a look at the statue itself. This is a statue that was commissioned in 1501, and it is very much associated with the city of Florence. Michelangelo was given a piece of marble, which, by the way, previously Donatello had some access to, but just sort of stopped doing the project. That marble goes through a few sculptors and eventually goes to Michelangelo, and he is asked to sculpt David, a character from the Bible, for the cathedral on Florence. Oh, I'm sorry, in Florence. Here is the cathedral, and up on that upper layer you see a number of statues that are about the same height, and originally David was supposed to go up there. When the statue was finished in 1504, people were amazed. It was seen as the paragon of beauty. It was seen as a great example of what Florence was capable of as an artistic center. And the subject matter happened to be a subject matter that was associated with the city of Florence itself. David was sort of their mascot or their symbol. They saw him, like Florence, as being the underdog who fought off the great big evil, say Goliath, or the Duke of Urbino, or I'm sorry, not the Duke of Urbino, the Duke of Milan, something like that. So rather than put the statue up on the cathedral, they put it in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, which is more or less the city hall in Florence, and it's a very, very important building. It's the only other building that reaches about the same height as the cathedral. Now, as Americans, we get very disturbed by the fact that David was up there in all his glory, very visible, and the idea of associating him with the front of a church. And just to let you know, there is a little way of sort of getting around not showing him with clothing when you read the biblical passage about how he put on armor and then took it off, and they don't say he put on something else. So, and that might be one way of explaining his nudity, but it's more likely associated with the fact that this is just referencing the classical past, and Michelangelo is very clearly referencing the classical past. I'll get back to that in just a bit. But going back to the idea that David is associated with Florence, here we have a few other sculptures of David that were made by Florentine artists to celebrate the city. You have Donatello's, which might be from the 1930s that you've already read about. And then Verrocchio's from the 1470s. This is one that I did not show you in class, but it's another image of David that was well appreciated by the Florentines. And then you have Michelangelo's. Michelangelo's is very different in a couple ways. This is a marble as opposed to a bronze statue, and furthermore, it is enormous. It is well over life size versus the smaller bronzes, which are about life size. And in that scale, Michelangelo's intention was to have it go up on the cathedral with all the other large statues, which are large because they had to be seen from the ground level. This also gets compared to Greek and Roman sculpture, particularly the kind called colossi, which are just really big statues. But that's kind of an after the fact thought. There are other classical references here. You have that perfected human body that the Greeks loved to show and that the Romans copied. You also have him standing in contrapposto. And there is a great deal of humanism here. Once again, that idea of the perfected body is a humanist idea. But the humanism goes farther on Michelangelo's David. If you look at the face of David, you'll see that it is very deeply carved. The way the hair was carved with what's called undercarving, where you actually get under the stone with a drill and scoop out some of the marble. It's quite difficult technically, but it gets used when you want to have a lot of contrast and be able to see things from far away. Furthermore, the face, the actual facial features are rather large on the face, and this is so that you can read them from the distance. If you look at his brow, his forehead, you'll see that his brow is furrowed, and it looks like he is thinking and pondering, he is concerned. And I want to point out that the moment that David chose to show here is very different from Verrocchio and Donatello's David. Donatello and Verrocchio showed the denouement, the end of the story, after the major exciting action has happened. And you can tell because they have the head of Goliath and the sword that David used to detach the head after he had killed him with a slingshot. If you look at Michelangelo's David, it is clear he has not killed Goliath. He still has a slingshot, he has a rock in his hand, and he is looking from one angle. He looks fairly nervous. From the other angle, he looks very thoughtful. And that kind of idea of showing him as a thinking man, as well as this perfected body, is humanist. Finally, I want to point out that the hand here is extra large. It's somewhat disproportionate. And when Michelangelo carved this, he did think it was going to be going up on the cathedral, and the deep undercutting on the facial expression and the size of the hand both relate to seeing this from far away. Also, you'll see that the proportions of the body are a little different from your typical Greek ideal proportions. The legs are a little short, but keep in mind, if you were seeing this up on the cathedral, the legs would look longer and the torso would look shorter. If the hand was a normal size rather than this enormous paw down there, it would be lost. But what you can see of the hand is this very clear attempt to show the tension of this moment. So he's picking this moment of tension. And this is something that you'll see in a lot of Michelangelo's sculptures. It's always dangerous to assume that when an artist shows something, especially before the 19th century, they are choosing to show something that's of interest specifically to them. But I can't help but think that Michelangelo is really sort of showing us the internal struggle that he had. That kind of internal struggle is always kind of captivating. And I always think of Michelangelo as showing those scenes right before the major action. Think of a Bruce Willis or an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. Right before the major action, the big battle at the end when they destroy the bad guy or at least stop the bad guy. They're showing us the scene right before it where they have that music that's building up to this crescendo. So this is right before the climax of the story. And that's something we'll see in a lot of other Michelangelo works. We're going to move on now to Michelangelo's best known work, which is the Sistine Chapel. And there's a great irony to this being one of his best known works. I'm not actually showing it to you now, I just want to give you a brief blurb about the history. You find images from the first couple books of Genesis. And right down here you can see them. One of the things that you might notice is they alternate between being a small panel set within 4 figures and then a large panel and then small panel with the 4 figures called nudi, which are just nudes. And it goes down the center in that very regular pattern. And I'm going to go through and show you each of one. So right here in the middle you see God separating light and darkness. Then down at the bottom you have the creation of the moon and the stars, or the sun and the stars. The little panel between the 4 nudi here is Christ separating the water and the land. And then the very famous creation of Adam. Up above that, you have the creation of Eve, which is smaller and within those 4 nude figures. After that, there is the first sin and the expulsion from the garden. We'll go into more detail on that in just a bit. And then above that, you have the family of Noah at the altar, sort of paying their obeisance to God. Above that, you have the flood. And finally, the drunkenness of Noah. And just in case you don't know this story of Noah, Noah was a good guy. There were a lot of bad people. God decided that he needed good people on earth. So he sent a flood to wipe out the bad people, and Noah and his family got all the animals on the boat, or 2 of each animal on the boat. And then the flood wipes out everyone else, and the world is without sin again. Alas, humanity is essentially sinful. So when Noah gets drunk and falls asleep, his sons make fun of him. And making fun of your father is one of the things that is in one of the 10 commandments. You are supposed to honor your mother and father. So this is the first sin after the flood. And what seems to be happening in these panels down the center, the scenes that are taken from Genesis, have a lot to do with creation, sin, and redemption. Some people have related that idea to Michelangelo's work as a sculptor. And sculptor involves graving lines. There's also a commandment against that. And many people felt that Michelangelo was very torn in his spirituality in multiple ways. But one of the ways was the fact that he was an image maker, and maybe he felt like that could have been skirting the line with disobeying God. He was also a great fan of Savonarola, who said that a lot of the stuff that Michelangelo was into, all that humanism and classicism, was bad. So that creation, sin, redemption idea might be related to Michelangelo. We don't know whether the stories that were chosen just by Michelangelo, or were they chosen by Michelangelo and then approved by the Pope's secretary. Did the Pope's secretary come up with them and then get the Pope's approval? We're just not quite sure. Regardless, this ceiling shows a very clear program. And down that center is the early stories of Genesis dealing with creation, sin, and redemption. And right in the middle is Eve. Eve was very much associated with evil. She is the first sinner. Back in the 70s, there was a bumper sticker that said Eve was framed, which I kind of loved, that idea. But it was outrageous. But the idea of Eve being associated with evil and sin, she is the first sinner, having her right at the center makes that especially significant, even though that's one of the panels that you never see reproduced very often. One of the great ironies about this is that Michelangelo did not start at the beginning of the narrative, which was close to the altar, where where God is separating the light and the dark. He started at the doorway, the entrance doorway where people would come in, which is where the end of the narrative cycle is. And if you look at this, you might notice that it's a lot easier to see what's going on towards the altar. The compositions are much more simple. They are much more clear. They're much more convincing. It really feels like you're looking up from the floor and seeing these things happen above you. Whereas the ones at the back, the first three in particular, are very difficult to read from the floor. There's so much detail in there that you miss a lot. Michelangelo, as I mentioned, was a bit paranoid about others watching him or stealing from him or trying to make him look bad. So when he started work on the Sistine ceiling, he put up a cloth across the area between the floor and the ceiling. He basically obscured everyone's view of what he was doing. And one of the drawbacks could have been that he did not get to get down to the floor and see how these things would look from the floor until after finishing those first three panels. He pulled the cloth away then to move it to the middle section, and he realized that the compositions need to be more simple. There's much more to the program, which is this collection of specific scenes and their arrangement. And that's a term we use often in art history. A program is a set of scenes or subject matter and how they are arranged. So you have the stories of Genesis down the center. Then below them on each side, as the ceiling starts to curve down, you have images of the Sibyls and the prophets. The Sibyls are classical figures or non-Jews who are said to tell the coming of Christ. And I've got up in the upper right-hand corner here the Libyan or Libica Sibyl, the spectacular, muscly woman. And then down in the lower left is Job, complete with his whale that looks a little more like a fish, but who is a prophet. Prophets are from the Old Testament. They are Jews who told the forecoming of Christ. So they're down there, and a lot of people see this use of the Sibyls and prophets as this sort of gateway going down to the lower walls, where the story of Christ and Peter is shown, as a way of linking what's going on in the ceiling to the walls below. Christ is going to be essential in the redemption of humanity, and so this is said to take into account everything in the chapel as opposed to just being this separate work that's only the ceiling that is unrelated to what had been done before. Finally, in the four corners, you have some scenes that you probably aren't as familiar with. David and Goliath, sure, we know that one. But Judith and Holofernes is less well known. And these are both stories of last-minute redemption. There were people who were facing evil generals who were going to take them out, take out the whole community, and someone was brave enough to stand up and go and do something about it. So these are sort of last-minute redemption stories. Down at the other end, the Brazen Serpent is a story that takes place while the Jews are wandering around in the desert for 40 years, and they become distraught and at some point start to worship another god. So they, rather than resist temptation, they succumb to sin. And the same thing with the hanging of Haman, which is such a long and complex story that I'm going to let you read it on your own. So this whole panel, the whole ceiling, appears to be a very clear construction relating creation, sin, and redemption down to the stories of Christ and Peter on the wall, and referring to the major theological concept of Christ granting humanity grace and thus redemption. So let's take a look at a few of the scenes in the Genesis series that runs down the center of the ceiling. We'll start out with the creation of Adam. This is a kind of unusual way of showing the creation of Adam. During the Middle Ages, typically God was showing sort of modeling Adam out of something kind of like clay. But here, Adam is already a fully formed figure, and I would point out that he is made in God's image, and you can see that they both have similar body types, and even the pose and curve of their pose is very similar. But whenever I look at this image, I don't think, oh yeah, this is God creating Adam in his own image. I think, look at Adam. Adam, he should have like a remote control in his hand, because he looks like someone who's just completely engrossed in TV and has turned their brain off, is going to be sitting on that couch just not moving. He looks so unanimated. There's no spark, there's no life, intellectually, physically, and maybe even spiritually here. Now, at the same time, God is swooping in this dynamic swoop. Look at that dark pink drapery around God and the unborn souls from limbo. And he's racing in there. His hair is flowing back like a bad 1970s music video. So you get a sense of speed and action. He's very concentrated. Look at his gaze and how there are kind of wrinkles on his brow, showing that he's looking directly where he's going. So you get a very different sense of the two figures. And one other thing that's happening here is Michelangelo is once again going back to that idea that he had used with David, where rather than showing the climax or the end of the story, he's showing the point right before the most exciting part. So this is just before that climax when God is going to touch Adam's hand and he's going to spring to life physically, intellectually, perhaps spiritually. He's going to have a very different feeling about him. And that's one thing that Michelangelo did really well here, and I believe that's one of the reasons why we like this so much. There's a few other things you might want to look at in this image. For instance, behind God is the figure of a woman, and she is Eve. She shows up in the next panel where we have the creation of Eve from Adam's rib, and a lot has been made about that being the central scene and focusing on the idea of Eve created from Adam's rib. And I would point out that there are some conflicting, maybe not conflicting, but there are multiple accounts of the creation of Adam and Eve in Genesis. In Genesis 1, God creates both man and woman, and there's no distinction in the time or in the method of creation. In Genesis 2, there is more distinction and more detail. And however you want to explain that is fine with me. But the image for the creation of Eve that was chosen for this series was the one where she is clearly subordinate to Adam. Let's move on to the fall and expulsion. This is one of the reasons Eve is so significant in this work. The story of the fall is basically that Adam and Eve were told not to eat from the tree of knowledge. Eve decided she wanted to eat from the tree of knowledge, convinced Adam to share the fruit from the tree of knowledge with her, and because they broke that rule, they get kicked out of the Garden of Eden and are forced to suffer life on earth. Adam has to toil or labor, and Eve will have pain during childbirth. So that's the basic story. And I believe that this is a brilliant panel from the series. And if you look at it, Michelangelo has very clearly defined the two subject matter, the fall on the left, the expulsion on the right. And that relates back to that kind of clarity that we see in high Renaissance art, something that is an outgrowth of humanism. Right in the center, you have this tree, the tree of knowledge, which appears to be a fig tree as well. You know, we always talk about this apple, but quite frankly, I would not give up my place in Eden for an apple. Mango, yeah, it must be one amazing fig though. Over here, on that tree, we have the tail of a serpent, and you always hear about a serpent in this story. But that serpent ends with the body of a woman who is Lilith, who is a character from Jewish stories who pre-existed God and thus was by her very nature evil. And also very much associated with carnal desires. And she is handing over the fruit. Notice how she is clearly connected to the tail, the serpent tail, and you can see how her leg follows down into that tail. But also, the tail kind of wraps around between the trunk and the two branches on the tree and spins off into the angel. And the angel has this kind of peach dress on, and you get these peach colors in the tail that tie the angel to the serpent's tail as well. So these two scenes are united by being brought back to that spiraling tail. And you have basically here cause and effect. There are a number of things that are a bit odd about this image. So the first one I want to talk about is how Michelangelo clearly shows us the figures who are good before their sin, and that goodness is shown through physical beauty. Look, for instance, at the face of Eve. And I know you're probably all saying, but look at those wild muscles on that woman. We'll get there in a little bit. That has less to do with it. But she does not have any marks of anything other than physical perfection on her face. if you go and look at Eve during the fall, she does not look physically perfect or beautiful. Her face is contorted, and her facial features have actually changed. And Michelangelo used the beauty of this ideal face to convey good, and then the less ideal faces that you see over on the right, and that those wrinkles and such cannot be conveyed only with expression. There is actually a facial structure change with these people. And that is supposed to convey man after sin, after he's fallen from God's perfection. The other thing I want to point out is what's going on the left. If you ask me, these are not two people out picking fruit. Eve's pose and her relationship to Adam's body are not natural for any kind of gardening or orchard work. And instead, it appears that there might be some oral sex going on, or had been going on. And there have been a number of scholars who have started to address this very overt reference to sexuality. Finally, people have started to mention it in the past 40 years. And they've related this also to the biblical story. So rather than just saying, oh yeah, Michelangelo was really interested in blowjobs and that's why it's up there, they're saying the story of the fall features not only them sinning by disobeying God, but upon gaining the knowledge from that fruit on the tree of knowledge, they realize that they're naked and they run and get some fig leaves. Why all of a sudden are they being concerned about their body? That has often been associated with, once they have that knowledge, then you have carnal desires, and many theologians of the period would believe that the first sin has much more to do with sex as opposed to eating your veggies and fruit. So that may be one of the things that Michelangelo was trying to indicate. Regardless, the thing that I now want to mention about Michelangelo is that he lived a really long time. He lived until he was 89. And he starts out, as a very young man. He's in the early Renaissance, and getting tutored by or apprenticed by people who are early Renaissance figures. He's lucky enough to be around for the High Renaissance and being recognized for his genius then. But then he lives for another 50 years. And in the Sistine Ceiling, one of the things that we're getting is a little taste of the next period that we'll cover, which is Mannerism. Mannerism is a period that is very much defined by individual artistic styles. And it is a move away from mimesis in favor of those artistic styles. There are a lot of things going on in the Sistine Ceiling that are very stylized. Look, for instance, at Eve's body. Look at that pose, which is called a serpentine pose because it twists so far around that it's almost a spiral. The Sibyl also has that twisted kind of crazy pose as opposed to the very natural and ideal contrapposto. That serpentine pose is very typical of Mannerist art. Look at the musculature, this exaggerated musculature. And sure, there might have been people who had a fair amount of muscles in the Renaissance. But this is not natural muscles for the Renaissance. There are not women who are working out for 5 hours a day and completely eradicating, carbs from their diet so that they can build this kind of musculature. This is an exaggeration. He might have been exaggerating to show what he felt was ideal, and the physical perfectibility of humanity, but it's still exaggerated and stylized. And finally, that tail. Serpents don't have that kind of tail, where you go from green to peach to green to peach. And that very bold color combination, and there are a lot of bold color combinations here, is another thing that we'll see in Mannerist art. And it's more stylized than mimetic. So this painting, I like to look at it as kind of a merging of the clarity of the High Renaissance and that overt stylization of mannerism, which you will read about in your next module.